The town of Redemption clung to the edge of the known world like a scab. Its air was thick, a sour cocktail of stale tobacco, old leather, and the ever-present dust that seeped in through every crack. Saloon doors swung on groaning hinges, spilling yellow light and the tinny plink of a weary piano onto the street. For Fletcher, it was a place to pass through, never to stay. But his horse, Dusty, had thrown a shoe, and his own supplies were low. Stasis felt like a cage. Inside the marshal's office, the air was even heavier. Marshal Thompson, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun-cracked worry, slid a poster across his desk. The paper was rough, the ink stark. Copper-masked raider, it read. Below the crude drawing of a figure with a featureless, metallic face, a bounty was listed that made Fletcher's throat go dry. $500. Wagon train hit 2 days ago. Thompson grunted, not looking up from the nail he was cleaning with the tip of his knife. Third one this month. The territorial governor wants it stopped. The poster says wanted. But the telegram that came with it made the preference clear. Breathing is optional. Fletcher didn't reach for the paper. His gaze was fixed on the worn grip of his own pistol, resting on his thigh. His hands, resting on his knees, were geography all their own. The palms were a landscape of calluses, crisscrossed with the faint white lines of old scars. They were hands that knew the pull of reins, the heft of an axe, the cold finality of a trigger. He didn't need the money to live. Not really. He had enough to drift for another year, but the stillness was eating him alive. The quiet nights under the stars had started to feel less like freedom and more like a slow burial. He needed the chase. He needed a direction, even if it was one set by another man's coin. "I'll take it," Fletcher said. His voice was gravelly, unused. Thompson finally looked up, his eyes a pale, washed-out blue. He saw the set of Fletcher's jaw, the way his gaze never wavered. He saw the frayed edges of the man's saddle blanket through the window, the deep sway in the back of the old roan tied to the hitching post. This wasn't a lawman. This was a tracker, a hunter, the kind of man who disappeared into the wilderness and came back with what he was sent for, or not at all. "Heard some things," Fletcher said, his voice low, "about this raider." Thompson leaned back, the chair groaning in protest. "Plenty of things to hear. Ghost, demon. Some say Apache spirit come to reclaim the land." "I heard," Fletcher continued, ignoring the folklore, "they only take food, medicine, grain, never touch gold, never harm a soul." The marshal shrugged, a gesture that was both a confirmation and a dismissal. A thief is a thief. They spooked a team on the last raid. Wagon went over. A boy broke his leg. That's harm enough for the governor. The details settled in Fletcher's gut, a small, hard stone of complication. It wasn't a clean job, it never was. But the boy's broken leg was a weight on one side of the scale, and the rumors of a selective thief were on the other. He pushed the thought aside. The job was the job. The motion was the cure. He left the office with a new direction and the weight of $500 in his future. He spent the last of his coin on jerky, hardtack, and a new shoe for Dusty, the blacksmith's hammer ringing a sharp, purposeful rhythm in the afternoon heat. He heard the whispers again at the general store as he bought cartridges. 2 women, their faces shadowed by their bonnets, spoke in hushed tones, took all of Mrs. Gable's laudanum, but left the silver locket her mother gave her right there on the counter. Fletcher packed his saddlebags, his movements economical and practiced. The worn leather of his saddle creaked a familiar song as he tightened the cinch. He swung himself up, the movement as natural as breathing, and nudged Dusty toward the edge of town. The desert opened up before him, a vast, silent expanse of ochre, rust, and pale sage green under a bleached white sky. The call of that emptiness was stronger than any human voice. It promised nothing but distance. And for Fletcher, that was everything. The trail was cold, but not invisible. Not to him. He found it 3 miles out from the overturned wagon, a single, unshod hoof print in a patch of hardened clay, too deliberate for a wild Mustang. He dismounted, crouching low. The wind whispered past his ears, carrying the scent of pine and dry earth. He followed on foot, leading Dusty, his eyes scanning the ground, reading the subtle language of the land. A bent twig here, a dislodged pebble there. He was a man who could read a story in a single blade of grass. Hours bled into a day, then 2. The world shrank to the signs left behind. He found the remains of a small fire, the ashes cold. In them, a half-burned piece of salted meat. Near the fire pit, he found a knot, a small piece of cordage tied around a bundle of dried herbs. He picked it up. It was an oak fiber cord, braided with a skill and a specific pattern he didn't recognize from any cavalry manual or cowboy's trick. It was tight, efficient, and clean, the work of someone who wasted nothing, not even motion. He rode deeper into the territory, the land changing around him. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills, then to the jagged teeth of canyons that clawed at the sky. This was Apache land, or it had been. He'd seen the maps in government offices, the neat lines drawn by men in faraway cities, carving up the world. He'd seen the treaties, signed with solemn promises and broken before the ink was dry. He wasn't a man given to politics, but he knew injustice when he saw it written on the landscape. He saw the bones of starved cattle, the abandoned wickiups, the palpable sense of a people squeezed into smaller and smaller corners of their own world. He pushed the thought away. It was a distraction. It was a weakness. On the 3rd day, he saw it. A flicker of movement high on a ridge. It wasn't the clumsy scramble of a prospector or the heavy tread of a soldier. It was a shadow that flowed over the rocks, fluid and certain, like water finding its own level. Then, for a single, blinding second, the sun caught something and threw a spark of light back at him, a flash of polished copper. He didn't give chase. That was a fool's game. The raider knew this land. Fletcher only knew how to hunt on it. He watched the direction the figure was heading, marking the path in his mind. He studied the terrain, the lines of the canyons, the natural funnels and dead ends. He was a patient man. He'd spent a lifetime learning that the quickest way to catch something was to let it come to you. He found the spot an hour before sunset, a narrow pass, barely wide enough for a single horse, with sheer rock walls rising on either side. It was a natural shortcut between 2 larger canyons, a path the raider would likely use to save time on their return journey. The acoustics were perfect. The stone walls would bounce sound, telegraphing an approach long before a rider came into view. He would hear them coming. Fletcher led Dusty into a small, hidden alcove, muffling the horse's nostrils with a cloth to keep it from whinnying. He checked his pistol, the click of the cylinder loud in the waiting silence. He drew the long, heavy blade he carried strapped to his leg. The steel felt cold and solid in his hand, an extension of his own will. He settled himself behind a cluster of boulders, his body hidden in the deep afternoon shadow, and he began to wait. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the rocks in hues of orange and deep purple. The air grew cool. The silence of the desert deepened, broken only by the hum of his own blood in his ears. Then he heard it. It started as a faint rhythm, a vibration felt more than heard. It grew steadily, a calm, confident beat, the sound of a single horse moving at a steady trot. No hesitation, no fear. Fletcher's grip tightened on the hilt of his knife. His heart, usually a slow, steady drum, began to pound against his ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. A cold sweat prickled his neck. This was different. He'd ambushed dozens of men in his life. Outlaws, deserters, bandits. Their approach was always marked by caution or by sloppy arrogance. This was something else entirely. This was the sound of a predator moving through its own territory. The hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls. Clip-clop, clip-clop. a steady, unhurried cadence. Fletcher held his breath, muscles coiled tight. He was ready to spring. And then the sound stopped. Silence, complete and absolute. It was more jarring than the approach. The figure should have been in the narrowest part of the pass by now, right in his trap, but they had stopped, just out of sight around the bend. Slowly, a shadow stretched around the corner of the rock face. Then the rider emerged. The horse was a dark, lean Mustang. The rider was slender, clad in buckskin, and on their face was the mask. It was smooth, catching the last of the dying light, its copper surface gleaming like a single, malevolent eye. The masked figure didn't move. They sat perfectly still in the saddle. Then their head tilted, just a fraction, a gesture of listening, of knowing. In that single, silent movement, the world shifted. The trap was gone. The element of surprise was gone. Fletcher was no longer the hunter. The person in the mask was no longer the prey. They were two equal forces poised at the edge of violence, and as their unseen eyes met his across the dusty ground, Fletcher understood with chilling certainty there was no turning back for either of them. The silence stretched, thin and tight. Fletcher rose slowly from his crouch, his movements deliberate, making no sudden gestures. The figure in the copper mask remained motionless, a bronze statue against the darkening rock. They were a study in stillness, a creature of the landscape, and for a moment, Fletcher felt like the intruder, the clumsy disruption in a world that did not belong to him. He took a step forward, the crunch of his boot on the gravel unnaturally loud. "You're causing a lot of trouble," Fletcher said, his voice a low rasp. It wasn't the opening he'd planned, but the situation had unraveled far beyond any plan. A voice came from behind the mask, clear and steady, with a timbre that was impossible to place. It was neither high nor low, carrying an unnerving lack of inflection. "I am only taking back what was stolen." The words hung in the air, a simple statement that was also a profound accusation. It was a collision of two worlds. For Fletcher, this was a job, a contract defined by a poster and a bounty. For the raider, it was a matter of justice, of balancing a scale he hadn't even known was tilted. There was no more room for talk. The raider swung down from the saddle, landing with a soft thud, a large knife already in hand. It was a practical, heavy-bladed weapon, meant for skinning game or cutting rope, but in their grip, it looked as deadly as any dueling sword. Fletcher didn't hesitate. He lunged, closing the distance in 3 long strides, his own blade sweeping in a wide, powerful arc aimed to disarm. He had the advantage of reach, a long arm and a powerful shoulder honed by years of hard living. He expected a clumsy parry, a panicked retreat. He got neither. The raider didn't retreat. They moved into the attack, a blur of motion. Their body ducked under his swinging arm, and their knife came up in a short, vicious slash. Fletcher felt a searing heat across his forearm as he twisted away, the buckskin of his sleeve parting like paper. He grunted, surprised by the speed, the sheer audacity of the move. Steel met steel. The sound was a sharp, ringing clang that shattered the desert quiet. Sparks flew, brief, angry stars in the twilight. The smell of hot metal and scraped stone filled the air. A fine red dust, disturbed by their feet, rose around them like a ghostly mist. The fight found its rhythm. It was a dance of opposites. Fletcher was power and reach, his movements designed to overwhelm. He drove his opponent back with heavy, cleaving blows, forcing them to give ground. But the raider was speed and precision. They never met his force head-on. They deflected, redirected, their blade a flickering extension of their will. Every one of their movements was economical, brutally efficient. There was no wasted energy, no theatrical flair. It was the calculated lethality of a creature that fights to survive, not to impress. Fletcher pressed his attack, the canyon walls echoing the percussive clang of their blades. He was bigger, stronger. Sooner or later, his opponent would tire. He feinted high, then brought his knife down in a low, sweeping cut aimed at the raider's leg. It was a move that had ended a dozen fights before they'd truly begun. The raiders seemed to anticipate it. They leaped backward, landing lightly on the balls of their feet, the blade passing a mere inch from their shin. Before Fletcher could recover his balance from the lunge, they were moving forward again, a whirlwind of controlled aggression. A stab, a slash, another stab. Fletcher was forced onto the defensive, parrying the rapid sequence of attacks. The blows came from unexpected angles, forcing him to twist and turn, his longer reach becoming a liability in the close quarters. He felt a grudging respect build in his chest. This was no common outlaw. This was a warrior. The skill was too deep, the instincts too sharp. He found himself focusing not on the bounty, but on the pure, raw mechanics of the fight. He had to think, to predict, to adapt. It had been a long time since anyone had made him do that. He saw an opening. The raider, in a swift parry, left their right side exposed for a fraction of a second. Fletcher pivoted, putting all his weight and momentum into a powerful thrust. This would be it. But it was a trap. The raider had baited him. At the last possible moment, they shifted their weight, and Fletcher's knife, instead of finding flesh, scraped harmlessly against the rock wall with a jarring screech. The impact sent a painful vibration up his arm, and for a critical instant, his grip loosened. It was the only mistake he'd made, but it was enough. The raider's hands shot out, not with their knife, but with their empty hand. They didn't grab his wrist, they struck it, a sharp, precise blow to the nerve that made his fingers go numb. His knife clattered to the ground. Disarmed, Fletcher reacted on pure instinct. He lunged forward, not to attack, but to grapple. He wrapped his arms around the raider's torso, using his superior weight to drive them backward. The raider was surprisingly strong, wiry and solid, but Fletcher's mass was too much. They stumbled, legs tangling, and went down together in a heap, rolling in the thick dust. The world became a chaotic blur of rock, sky, and struggling limbs. Fletcher ended up on top, pinning the raider beneath him. He had one hand on their knife arm, pinning it to the ground, and used his other to press a forearm against their throat. He had them. The fight was over. He was breathing heavily, the metallic taste of adrenaline in his mouth. He looked down, and for the first time, he was close enough to see himself. His own grimy, bearded face was reflected in the polished copper of the mask, distorted and monstrous. He stared at the reflection, at the featureless void that had been his adversary. The need to see, to know who he had been fighting, was overwhelming. With his free hand, he reached down, hooked his fingers under the edge of the mask, and ripped it away. His muscles froze. His breath caught in his lungs. The entire world seemed to lurch to a halt. It was a woman. Her face, framed by sweat-dampened black hair, was smudged with dirt and grime. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and a mouth set in a firm, defiant line. But it was her eyes that held him captive. They were the darkest eyes he had ever seen, and they were not filled with fear or surrender. They were blazing. They burned with a fierce, untamed fire, a raw and potent self-possession that seemed to scorch him where he knelt. He had expected a hardened criminal, a desperate man. He found a force of nature. The shock was a physical blow, a current that locked his joints and emptied his mind. In that single, heartbeat-long moment of paralysis, everything changed. She moved beneath him, not with frantic struggle, but with a fluid, practiced motion. She bucked her hips, throwing his weight off balance. The hand he had pinned to the ground twisted with impossible strength, her knife slipping free. In the same instant, she brought her knee up sharply into his side, forcing a pained grunt from him. He was rolled onto his back before he could even process what was happening. The dusty ground was hard against his spine. The darkening sky spun above him. And then she was kneeling over him, her weight pinning him down. The point of her knife rested gently, almost delicately, against the soft skin of his throat. He could feel its cold, sharp promise. Her hair fell around her face, and he could feel the warmth of her breath, soft and quick, ghosting across his lips. The fire in her eyes had not dimmed. It had intensified. She looked down at him, and he saw no triumph, no malice, only a grave finality. "You have seen my face," she said. Her voice, without the mask to muffle it, was low and clear. It was not a question. It was a statement of destiny, a declaration that a line had been crossed from which there was no return. Fletcher lay there, the cold steel at his neck, her warm breath on his mouth, lost in the depths of her eyes. He had come for a bounty, a simple, violent transaction. He had found something infinitely more complex and dangerous. And just as that thought solidified, a new sound cut through the stillness. It was faint at first, then rapidly growing louder, the unmistakable thunder of galloping hooves. It wasn't one horse, or even two. It was a dozen, maybe more, and they were coming from multiple directions, their sounds echoing and converging on the narrow canyon. They were being hunted, but the posse closing in wasn't just his, it was hers, too. The thunder of hooves was no longer a distant threat. It was a physical force, a vibration that traveled through the rock and into Fletcher's bones. The men were close, shouting to one another, their voices sharp and angry. The woman above him, Ayanna, tensed. The point of the knife at his throat didn't waver, but her eyes darted toward the mouth of the canyon. A choice was being made in the flickering light, a calculation of survival that now, inexplicably, included him. Then, her decision landed. "Get up!" she hissed, the command urgent and absolute. The knife vanished from his throat. Her hand, strong and surprisingly small, grabbed the front of his shirt and hauled him to his feet with a strength that belied her slender frame. "Run!" For a stunned moment, Fletcher just stood there, his mind struggling to catch up. 1 second she was his captor, the next his savior. The approaching riders were here for both of them, a fact that seemed to forge an instantaneous, unwilling alliance. He didn't have time to question it. He simply obeyed. She was already moving, not back the way they had come, but sideways, toward the sheer rock face. She ran with a familiar grace, her feet finding purchase on the uneven ground as if she were born to it. He followed, his longer legs stumbling to match her nimble pace. She pressed her hand against a section of the canyon wall that looked solid, a seamless facade of red stone. But as she pushed, a narrow, vertical sliver of darkness appeared. It wasn't a cave mouth. It was a crack, a flaw in the rock barely wider than a man's shoulders. "In here," she ordered, already turning sideways to slip through. "Now!" Fletcher didn't hesitate. He dove into the opening just as the first rider galloped into view at the far end of the pass. The world instantly compressed. The roar of the approaching horses was muffled, replaced by the tight, claustrophobic scrape of his own body against the stone. It was less a passage and more an ordeal. The rock was rough and unforgiving. He could feel it tearing at the fabric of his shirt, at the skin of his shoulders and back. His breath came in ragged, painful gasps. The air was cool and dead, tasting of ancient stone and damp earth. Behind him, he could hear Ayanna's own labored breathing, a steady, rhythmic presence in the suffocating dark. They moved forward in a clumsy shuffle, their bodies wedged tight. Every inch was a victory earned through friction and pain. He felt a sharp sting as a jagged edge of rock caught his arm, and he knew he was bleeding, the warm wetness a slick track against his skin. They were in total darkness now. The narrow slice of twilight from the entrance was gone. The only sound was their own desperate breathing and the scraping of their boots. Then, another sound penetrated their stone sanctuary voices, loud, clear, and terrifyingly close. "Spread out, check every crack." It was a voice accustomed to command, sharp with frustration. She couldn't have just vanished. Fletcher froze, every muscle in his body locking up. Ayanna bumped into his back, and he felt her hand press lightly against his spine. A silent command to stay still. They stood together in the blackness, two enemies bound by a shared predator. "Marshall, look here," another voice called out, much closer this time. "This fissure, it's narrow, but a person could fit." The words hung in the suffocating air. Fletcher held his breath, the pounding of his own heart a deafening drum in his ears. He could feel Ayanna's stillness behind him. So absolute it was as if she had ceased to exist. They were caught. There was no escape. A shadow fell across the entrance to their hiding place, blocking the faint ambient light that had begun to filter in. The silhouette of a man, broad-shouldered and holding a rifle, filled the narrow opening. They were no more than 10 feet from him. Fletcher could smell them. The sour, acrid scent of a man who'd been in the saddle all day. The rich tang of horse leather. The faint whiff of chewing tobacco. It was the scent of the law, of the world he was supposed to be a part of. The shadow leaned forward, peering into the darkness. Fletcher's hand instinctively went to where his knife should have been, but his fingers met only empty air. He was defenseless. He braced himself for the shout of discovery, for the blast of a rifle in the enclosed space. He could hear the man breathing, a low, steady rasp. 1 second passed, then 2. It felt like an eternity. The man in the entrance grunted, a sound of dismissal. "It's nothing. Goes back maybe 20 feet and stops. Too tight for a man to fight in. A snake hole." Just as the shadow began to pull back, a shout came from further down the canyon. Tracks found tracks heading north, over the ridge. 2 horses. The shadow at their entrance straightened up. "You sure? Silas?" "Clear as day, Marshal. They're fresh." There was a pause. Then the marshal's voice boomed again, this time moving away. "All right, men, to the north. Let's ride. We've got her cornered now." The thunder of hooves resumed. Not approaching, but receding. The voices faded, swallowed by the vastness of the desert. The shadow in the entrance was gone. For a long time, the only sound was the distant echo of the departing posse, and then a profound, ringing silence. Fletcher let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It came out as a shaky, uncontrolled shudder. His body, which had been coiled as tight as a spring, suddenly felt weak, his legs threatening to give way. Behind him, Ayanna did not move. He waited. The silence stretched. He could feel the tension radiating from her, a focused, disciplined energy. She was listening, waiting for the last echo to die, for the last vibration to fade from the rock. Finally, after what felt like an hour, she shifted. She moved past him, her body brushing against his in the tight space, and went to the entrance. She didn't just look out. She performed a careful, methodical check. She peered out from one side of the crack, her head low, for a full minute. Then she repeated the process on the other side. A faint sliver of moonlight now pierced the gloom, and it caught her face in profile. For the first time, he saw a detail that the fury of their fight had hidden: a small, white scar that cut vertically through her left eyebrow, a tiny flaw in the fierce perfection of her face. It was an old mark, the ghost of a past pain. Satisfied, she turned back from the entrance, her form a dark silhouette against the pale night sky. "They're gone, for now," she said, her voice a low murmur that was absorbed by the stone walls. Fletcher leaned his head back against the cool rock, closing his eyes. The adrenaline was draining out of him, leaving a hollow exhaustion in its wake. "You disarmed me," he said, the words coming out rougher than he intended. "In the canyon. You could have finished it." She was silent for a moment. He opened his eyes and found her watching him, her expression unreadable in the deep shadows. "I am not a butcher," she said finally. "I only take what we need to live. Food, medicine. Your life is not something I need." The simplicity of her statement struck him harder than any blow. He had been operating in a world of contracts and bounties, of wanted posters that preferred a man dead. She was operating in a world of necessity. It was a moral clarity that shamed the murky justifications he lived by. The treaties, he found himself saying. The words, almost a confession. I've seen them, the ink in the paper. They're worthless. It was the first time he had ever said it out loud. It was a truth he had carried silently for years, a piece of grit in his soul. He had enforced the laws that grew from those broken promises, hunted the men and women who had been displaced by them. He had always told himself it was just a job, but looking at her, at the scar above her eye, at the fierce dignity that even the darkness could not hide, the lie felt thin and brittle. He felt, for the first time, that he was standing on the wrong side of a line he had never even bothered to see. Ayana's expression didn't change, but he felt a subtle shift in the space between them. The tension didn't disappear, but it altered its nature. It was no longer the simple animosity of hunter and prey. It was something more complex, more dangerous. "They will be back," she said, her voice pulling him from his thoughts. "When they realize the tracks were false, they will return and search this entire canyon, rock by rock. We have to leave this place before the moon is high." She gestured deeper into the blackness of the crevice. "We cannot go out the way we came, but there is another way. A back way." She paused, and he could feel the weight of her next words. "It is very narrow, much narrower than this. Many do not make it." The silence that followed her words was heavier than the rock surrounding them. A way out, but a way that might be its own kind of end. Fletcher felt the deep, primal fear of being trapped underground, a fear that was older and colder than any fear of a bullet or a knife. He looked into the impenetrable blackness of the passage she indicated, then back at the faint moonlight spilling through the entrance. Out there was a posse, a marshal, and a world that, however hostile, was at least familiar. In here was the unknown. "My people are in the high country," Ayana said, her voice quiet but resonant in the tight space. "A gathering place. It is a 3-day journey from here. Through land they watch closely." She was offering him a choice, though it felt less like a choice and more like a fall from one ledge to another. He understood the unspoken terms of her proposal. To go with her wasn't just to flee the marshal. It was to cross a line. It was to abandon his contract, his word, and the unspoken allegiance that came with the color of his skin. He would be turning his back on the forts, the towns, the entire structure of the world he moved through. He would be a traitor. The word tasted like rust in his mouth. He weighed it. On one side was the $500 bounty, the marshal's grudging respect, the familiar solitude of his life. On the other was this woman, with a scar above her eye and a cause he was only just beginning to comprehend. He thought of the broken treaties, the empty promises. He thought of the way she fought, not with rage, but with a fierce, desperate precision. He thought of the fire in her eyes when he had torn the mask away. His world had been simple before that moment. Now, its simplicity felt like a lie. He gave a single, slow nod. "All right." The word was quiet, but it was the loudest sound he had ever made. It was the closing of one door and the hesitant opening of another. He had spent his entire life defined by his independence, his ability to ride away from anything and anyone. Now, he was tying his fate to a stranger, an enemy he had been paid to hunt. A flicker of surprise, or perhaps something else, crossed her face before the shadows reclaimed it. She had expected him to argue, to refuse. His easy acceptance seemed to disarm her more than their fight had. "This way," she said, her voice softer now. She turned and led the way into the deeper darkness. The passage was a nightmare. It twisted and turned, narrowing until Fletcher had to exhale completely to squeeze his chest through. The rock was a constant, abrasive pressure on all sides. It was a physical and mental torment, a test of will against the crushing weight of the earth. They moved in total blackness, guided only by the sound of each other's breathing and the feel of the wall. Several times, he felt the panic rising, the certainty that the walls were closing in, that he would be entombed here forever. Each time, he would hear the faint scrape of her boot ahead of him, a small sound of progress that was his only anchor. After what could have been minutes or an eternity, he saw a faint gray light ahead. They emerged, gasping, into a small, hidden bowl in the rock, open to the night sky. The moon was high and bright, a silver coin in a sea of black velvet. It illuminated a tiny, sheltered clearing, no bigger than a small room, with a trickle of water spilling from a crack in the rock and forming a small, clear pool. They stood there for a moment, simply breathing the clean, open air. The claustrophobia of the passage slowly receded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. "The wound on your arm," she said, her voice returning to its practical, steady tone. "It needs cleaning." Before he could protest, she had dipped a piece of cloth from her pouch into the pool. She gestured for him to sit. He obeyed, his body moving stiffly. He sat on a flat stone near the water's edge and held out his arm. The gash from her knife was a dark, ugly line from his wrist to his elbow, the sleeve of his shirt stiff with dried blood. She knelt in front of him. In the moonlight, he could see her face clearly. The hard lines of the warrior were softened, her expression focused and serious. Her hands, which had wielded a knife with such deadly skill, were now impossibly gentle. She carefully washed the cut, her touch light, her movements efficient. The cold water stung, but it was a clean, sharp pain that was almost a relief. He watched her, watched the way the moonlight caught the silver in her dark hair, the focused intensity in her eyes. This close. She wasn't a symbol or a masked raider. She was just a woman, tending to a wound she herself had inflicted. The contradiction was a quiet storm in his mind. When she was done, the wound was clean, the edges of the skin raw and pale. She produced a small pouch of dried leaves, crushed them between her fingers, and pressed the green paste into the cut. It smelled of sage and pine. "It will keep the corruption out," she explained, binding the arm with a clean strip of cloth. They sat in silence for a long moment. The only sound the soft murmur of the spring. The intimacy of her care had built a fragile bridge across the chasm of violence that had separated them just hours before. The boundary between them had changed. He felt it was time to give it a name. "Fletcher," he said into the quiet. She looked up from tying the knot, her dark eyes meeting his. She held his gaze for a beat, then gave a slight nod. Ayanna. The name settled between them, simple and solid. The faceless bounty hunter and the masked raider were gone. In their place sat Fletcher and Ayanna, two people in a hidden place, with a long and dangerous road ahead. The question had been building in him since she had pulled him to his feet, a question that was more important than the posse or the journey ahead. "Why?" he asked, his voice low. "Back in the canyon. Why did you help me? Why run with me?" Ayanna finished her work, her hands falling to her lap. She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the shimmering surface of the pool. She seemed to be considering her answer, or perhaps considering whether to answer at all. "You saw my face," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The law would hang you for helping me. But if they caught you with me, and you told them who I was, you would be a hero, you would have your bounty, you would be safe. Yet, you ran with me into the dark." She finally turned to look at him, her eyes searching his. "You are the one who should answer." "Why?" He looked at his bandaged arm, at the evidence of her capacity for both violence and healing. He thought of the reflection of his own face in her mask, of the blinding shock of seeing her, the person, beneath it. He had no grand, noble answer. There was only the raw, undeniable truth of that moment. "Because when I saw your face," he said, his voice honest and clear, "everything changed. The job, the money, the lines on the map. They stopped making sense. It wasn't a raider I was fighting anymore. It was you." A stillness came over her. He could see a flicker of some unknown emotion in her eyes, vulnerability, surprise, something he couldn't name. She looked away again, but not before he saw the slight softening of her mouth. "In my life," she said, speaking to the water, "when the world sees my face, it brings only two things: a gun or a cage. No one has ever looked at me and chosen my side over their own. Not someone like you." The quiet weight of her admission filled the small clearing. He understood that he had done something unprecedented, something that had shaken her world as much as she had shaken his. The trust between them was no longer just a necessity for survival. It was something more, a thin, fragile sprout pushing its way up through the hard rock of their lives. Their moment of peace was shattered by a sound from below, from the canyon they had just escaped. It was the clatter of a horse's shoe on stone, followed by the low murmur of men's voices. Instantly, Ayanna was on her feet, her body coiled and alert. She put a finger to her lips and moved to the edge of the rocky bowl, peering down through a narrow gap. Fletcher joined her, his heart beginning to pound again. Below, they could see the flicker of a torch. The posse was back. They had discovered the false trail and had returned to search the canyon properly. They were moving slowly, methodically, checking every shadow. "They are smarter than I thought," Ayanna whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "The marshal is a patient man." They were trapped. There was no way back down, and the passage they had come through was a death trap if the posse decided to explore it. They flattened themselves against the rock, hidden in the deep shadows of the overhang, praying the moonlight wouldn't betray them. They watched as the men below searched, their torches casting long, dancing shadows. Then they heard the marshal's voice, clear in the still night air. "Nothing. We've checked every inch of this canyon. If they were here, they're gone now." "Maybe they doubled back south," another man suggested. "It's possible." The marshal conceded, his voice heavy with fatigue. "We've been running all day. The horses are spent. We'll make camp at the south end of the canyon, get some rest. We'll pick up the trail again at first light." The men grumbled their assent. The torches began to move away, heading back down the canyon. Fletcher and Ayanna stayed motionless, listening until the last sound of the posse faded into the night. They were safe, but only for a few hours. "At dawn, they will begin their search again," Ayanna said, her voice grim. "We have to be far from here by then." "Which way do we go?" Fletcher asked. She pointed toward the east, where the land opened up into a series of rolling, accessible hills. "That is the easy way. It leads toward the river. It is the path they will expect us to take. By now, they will have sent riders to block it." She then turned and pointed north, toward a formidable silhouette that rose against the star-dusted sky. It was a massive ridge of jagged, broken rock, a wall of stone that looked utterly impassable. "That leaves only one way," she said, a new, hard edge to her voice. "The northern route, over Serpent's Tooth Pass. It is steep, treacherous, and the wind can strip the skin from your bones. The old stories say it is a path for spirits, not for men." Her eyes met his in the moonlight, dark and serious. "It is our only chance. The path did not exist. There was only the mountain, a colossal beast of stone and shadow sleeping against the stars. Serpent's Tooth Pass was not a trail to be followed, but a riddle to be solved, one handhold at a time. The wind was a blade, honed on the high peaks, and it cut through Fletcher's worn coat, seeking his bones. Every breath was a small victory against the thin, cold air. His world had shrunk to the few feet of rock illuminated by the sliver of a moon, and the sound of Ayanna's steady breathing just ahead of him. His hands, already calloused and tough, were scraped raw against the rough granite. His fingers, numb with cold, burned with a dull ache. He moved on a rhythm of pain and will, his mind emptied of everything but the next move. This was a different kind of tracking, a vertical hunt where the prey was a safe place to put his foot. He followed her lead without question. She moved with a terrifying, weightless grace, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. Her feet found purchase on ledges he couldn't even see. She seemed to know the mountain's secrets, to feel its structure through the soles of her worn moccasins. He was the stronger of the two. But here, on the sheer face of this rock, his strength was a clumsy, heavy burden. He reached for a thick outcrop of rock, a solid-looking anchor for his next move. It looked safe, a gift from the mountain. Before his fingers could grasp it, her voice, a sharp, low hiss, cut through the wind. "Don't!" He froze, his body tensed. "It's solid," he whispered back, his voice hoarse. "No, it's a scale, hollow underneath." He hesitated, his judgment warring with her certainty. He trusted his eyes, but he had seen the way she moved, the way she knew this place. Slowly, he retracted his hand. He found another hold, a less promising one, and pulled himself up. As his head cleared the ledge, he nudged the outcrop he had almost trusted with the toe of his boot, with a dry, grating sound. The slab of rock broke free and tumbled into the abyss. It didn't make a sound as it landed. It just vanished into the infinite blackness below. A cold sweat, colder than the wind, slicked his skin. She had saved his life. An hour later, it happened again. They were traversing a narrow ledge, their backs pressed to the wall. The path ahead seemed to widen slightly, a small pocket of safety. He took a step toward it, eager for a moment's respite. "Stop!" she commanded, her arm shooting out to bar his chest. He looked down. In the faint moonlight, he could now see what she had sensed. The wider section of the ledge was a thin crust of weathered rock and scree, a treacherous illusion of stability over a sheer drop. One step would have sent him plunging into the void. He looked at her, his throat too tight to form words. She simply nodded, her eyes never leaving the path ahead, and continued on. They found it near what he guessed was midnight, a deep recess in the rock, a shallow cave carved by wind and time, with an overhang that sheltered it from the relentless gale. It was no bigger than a grave, but it was sanctuary. They collapsed into it, their legs giving way at the same time. They sat huddled together, their backs against the cold stone, their breath pluming in front of them like the ghosts of spoken words. The silence was absolute, broken only by the howl of the wind outside their shelter and the frantic pounding of their own hearts. A tremor ran through Ayana's body. It was small at first, then stronger, an uncontrollable shiver that shook her frame. The cold, which had been an enemy to fight, was now an invader setting up camp in their bones, without thinking, without planning. Fletcher shifted closer and wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her against his side. The buckskin of her tunic was stiff and cold, but underneath it, he could feel the wiry strength of her, and the violent shuddering. "Just for the warmth," he said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. She didn't pull away. She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. Her shivering didn't stop, but it seemed to lessen, as if his body heat was a bulwark against the invading chill. He was acutely aware of everything: the weight of her head, the faint scent of sage and pine that clung to her hair, the feeling of her heart beating a rapid, exhausted rhythm against his ribs. It was a proximity born of desperation, but it felt like more. It felt like a confession. For a long time, they sat like that, sharing a pocket of warmth in the heart of the frozen mountain. The physical hardship had stripped them down to something raw and essential. There were no more masks, no more roles. They were just two people, trying to survive the night. "My father believed in their words," she said, her voice so quiet he almost thought it was the wind. He looked down and saw she was staring out into the blackness, her eyes fixed on a past he couldn't see. "He was a clan chief," she continued, her voice a low, steady murmur. "He met with the agents from the fort. He listened to their promises of land that would be ours forever. He signed their papers. He believed that the law written on a piece of paper was stronger than a man's greed. He told our warriors to lay down their rifles, to trust in the treaty. He said our honor demanded we keep our word, and that their honor demanded the same." She fell silent, The wind moaned a mournful chorus around them. When the prospectors came for the gold in our hills, he showed them the paper. They laughed at him. When the soldiers came to force us from the river valley, he showed the treaty to their captain. The captain used the paper to light his cigar. They rounded up our people. They marched us to the dry lands, the place they called a reservation. Many of our elders and children did not survive that march. My father, he died there. Not from a bullet. He just stopped. He died of a broken promise. His heart gave out because the world he believed in was a lie. She took a slow, shaky breath. Before he died, he told me that a promise is a living thing. If it is betrayed, it does not die. It becomes a debt of blood and justice. I am here to collect that debt. Fletcher felt the story settle inside him, a cold, heavy stone. He had heard 100 versions of it, from the mouths of cynical soldiers and bitter settlers, but he had never heard it like this. He had never felt the weight of it. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling like pebbles in the face of her mountain of grief. "I do not want your sorrow," she said, not unkindly. "I want you to understand." He did understand. He understood that his $500 contract was a single thread in a vast, ugly tapestry of betrayal. He was a tool of the men who had lit their cigars with her father's honor. The thought made him feel hollow. "I've never fought for anything," he admitted. The confession pulled from a deep, lonely place inside him. "Not really. My whole life. I just keep moving. It's the only thing I'm any good at. Leaving. I learned a long time ago to leave before anyone has the chance to be disappointed in me." She shifted, lifting her head to look at him. In the faint, ambient light, her eyes were dark pools of shadow, but he could feel their intensity. "Will you leave?" she asked. The question was simple, direct, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't about the posse or the journey. It was about them, about this fragile, unnamed thing that was forming between them on a frozen ledge in the middle of nowhere. He searched himself for an answer, for the old, familiar instinct to plan his escape, but it wasn't there. For the first time in his life, the road ahead was a complete and utter blank. "I don't know," he said, and it was the most honest thing he had ever said. Her gaze held his for a moment longer, and in it, he saw not disappointment, but a flicker of understanding. The distance between them had closed. A sound from below cut through the moment, a faint scrape, the unmistakable clatter of a dislodged stone tumbling into the darkness. Instantly, they both went rigid. Fletcher's hand went for his missing knife. Ayanna was already moving, peering over the edge of their shelter. They both thought the same thing, the marshal. They had somehow been tracked, even here. But the light that appeared below was not the bright, steady flame of a soldier's lantern. It was a single, flickering torch, held aloft by a figure who was climbing the rock face with the same impossible ease as Ayanna. The figure was shorter, broader. As the torchlight illuminated the face, Fletcher saw it wasn't a man. It was a woman, her face a mask of weathered wrinkles, her graying hair tied back in a tight braid. She moved with the steady, unhurried certainty of someone walking across a flat room, her hands and feet finding holds as if the mountain itself were guiding them. The woman reached their ledge and pulled herself up in one fluid motion. She gave them a brief, assessing glance, her eyes sharp and intelligent. There was no surprise in her expression. "Ayanna," she said, her voice low and raspy, like stones grinding together. "I was told I would find you here." "Nayeli," Ayanna breathed, a mixture of relief and concern in her voice. "What is it? What's wrong?" Nayeli looked from Ayanna to Fletcher, her gaze lingering on him for a moment before returning to the younger woman. She extinguished her torch, plunging them back into near darkness. "The marshal is not a fool," Nayeli said, her words stark and stripped of any comfort. "He has sent riders east and west. The river crossings are watched. The lower passes are trapped. Every path from this mountain, every drop of water, has a rifle aimed at it. There is no way down. Naeli's words settled over their small shelter like a shroud. No way down. Trapped on the roof of the world with an army below. Fletcher felt a familiar, cold knot tighten in his gut, the feeling of a trap closing. But for Ayanna and Naeli, it was not a moment of despair. It was a tactical problem. "Then we do not go down," Naeli stated, her voice as hard and practical as the rock she had just climbed. "We go through." She gave them no time to rest. Before the first hint of gray softened the eastern sky, they were moving. Naeli led them not up or down, but sideways, into a crack in the rock face that Fletcher would have mistaken for a shadow. The passage was a vertical maze, a series of tight squeezes, blind drops, and narrow ledges hidden from the world below. It was a path that did not appear on any map, a secret known only to the mountain and the people who treated it as an ally. They moved in a silence so profound that Fletcher could hear the blood pulsing in his ears. There was no moon now, only the faint, distant light of the stars. He navigated by sound and feel, the scrape of Naeli's boot ahead, the solid presence of Ayanna behind him. He was a tracker, a man who read the earth. But this was a different language, one spoken in the dark by the contours of unseen stone. He was blind, and for the first time in his life, he was utterly dependent on the trust of others. Just as the sky was beginning to turn the color of a deep bruise, they emerged. They crawled out of a low, horizontal fissure at the base of the cliff and found themselves in a landscape of man-made desolation. Before them lay the skeletal remains of an abandoned copper mine. A rusted headframe clawed at the dawn sky like a broken hand. Piles of gray-green slag. The mountain's entrails lay in silent, geometric heaps. The air tasted of bitter metal and defeat. It was a place of ghosts, a wound in the earth that had been bled dry and left to rot. And they were not alone. 5 figures detached themselves from the shadows of the mining equipment. They were not soldiers. They were Apache, armed with a mix of old rifles and bows, their faces grim and unreadable in the half-light. They moved with a coiled, predatory stillness, their eyes fixed on Fletcher. Ayanna stepped forward, speaking in her own language, her tone a mix of command and reassurance. The men listened, their gazes never leaving Fletcher. But a large, powerfully built man with a deep scar running from his temple to his jaw stepped forward, interrupting her. His eyes were like chips of obsidian, hard and unforgiving. He looked at Fletcher not as a person, but as a contamination. He spoke, his voice a low growl. And though Fletcher did not understand the words, the meaning was as clear as a knife's edge. He was looking at Fletcher, but his words were for Ayanna. Ayanna's response was sharp, her voice cutting through the tension. The big man, Takakota, shook his head, unconvinced. He gestured at Fletcher with his rifle. "He understands this language better," Takakota said, switching to a rough, heavily accented English. His eyes bored into Fletcher. To travel with him is betrayal enough. To bring him here, it is a sickness you invite into our home. "He is with me," Ayanna said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "He is under my protection." "Your protection does not feed the children he helps to starve," Takakota shot back. He took a step toward Fletcher, his hand tightening on his rifle. "Give me one reason why I should not end this threat right now." Before Ayanna could answer, Fletcher spoke, his own voice sounding hollow in the vast, dead space of the mine. "You'd be wasting a bullet." Takakota's eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected the prey to speak. "I am worth $500 to the men who hunt you," Fletcher continued, his gaze steady, dead. "I am worth nothing but a hole in the ground, alive. I might be worth something to you." The cold logic seemed to give Takakota pause. He grunted, a sound of reluctant agreement. But the hostility in his eyes did not waver. He gave a sharp command in Apache. 2 of the warriors moved to flank Fletcher, their rifles held at the ready. They did not touch him, but their presence was a cage. He was a prisoner. They were marched away from the mine, into a thick forest of ponderosa pine. The trail was invisible, a ghost path that wound through the dense trees. They moved quickly and silently, the pines swallowing the sound of their passage. After an hour, the forest began to thin, and Fletcher smelled at first the scent of wood smoke on the clean mountain air. Then he heard it the murmur of voices, the distant laughter of a child, the soft nicker of a horse. They emerged from the tree line onto the edge of a wide, hidden meadow, a secret valley cupped in the palm of the mountains, dozens of wickiups. Simple dome-shaped dwellings made of branches and hides were scattered across the valley floor. Horses grazed peacefully in a makeshift corral. Children, their faces bright and curious, stopped their games to stare at the newcomers, their eyes wide at the sight of the white man. This was not a war camp. This was a community, a home. It was the place Ayanna was fighting for, the lives she was protecting with her raids. The understanding settled on Fletcher with the weight of a physical blow. He was not just a man in the wrong place. He was the living embodiment of the threat that hung over this entire valley. Every eye that fell on him was filled with a mixture of fear and hatred. He was the wolf, invited into the sheepfold. He was led to the center of the camp, where a large fire burned, its smoke rising in a thin, straight line into the morning sky. 5 people, 3 men and 2 older women, sat on blankets in a semicircle, waiting. Their faces were impassive, etched with the lines of hardship and responsibility. This was the council. Fletcher was halted before them. Takakota spoke in a low, rapid torrent of Apache, his words a clear and damning indictment. He gestured at Fletcher, his meaning needing no translation. Throughout his speech, Ayanna stood tall and silent, her face a mask of controlled calm. When Takakota finished, one of the elders, a man with a face as wrinkled as a dried apple, turned his piercing gaze on Fletcher. "The tracker asks why he should not have killed you," the elder said in slow, careful English. "It is a good question. Ayanna says you saved her life, after you were sent to take it. This is a story that is hard to understand." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Fletcher's. "So, you will tell us. Why did you help her?" The question was a spear point aimed at his heart. The entire camp seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for his answer. He could not tell them the whole truth, not the part about the sudden, world-altering shock of seeing her face. It was too personal, too incomprehensible. He had to give them something they could weigh. "Because it was the right thing to do," Fletcher said, his voice steady. A murmur went through the assembled people. The answer was simple, almost childishly so. The elder considered it for a long moment, his head tilted. "Right," he said, the word tasting strange in his mouth. He looked around the circle, at the faces of his people, at the children hiding behind their mothers. He then looked back at Fletcher, and his next question dismantled Fletcher's entire world. Right for whom? The question drilled into Fletcher's chest, leaving him with no air, no answer. He saw the truth of it in a blinding flash. Right was not a fixed point, not a star to navigate by. It was a patch of ground, and your position on it depended entirely on which side of the rifle you were standing. What was right for him, for the marshal, for the men who signed the treaties, was a death sentence for these people. He had no answer. He could only stand there, exposed and silent, the full weight of his own complicity pressing down on him. Into that silence, Ayanna stepped forward. She stood beside Fletcher, facing the council. "He is with me," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that cut through the suspicion. "When the soldiers were upon us, he ran into the dark with me when he could have given me up for gold and glory. On the mountain, he shared his warmth so I would not freeze. I do not know what is in his heart. I do not know what he will do tomorrow, but I know what he did yesterday." She met the gaze of each council member. "One by one, I stake my name and my honor on his life. Let his debt be my debt. Let his betrayal, if it comes, be my betrayal." A profound silence fell over the gathering. She had offered the most sacred thing she possessed as collateral for his life. She had bound his fate to her own in front of her entire community. The council exchanged long, silent looks. The decision was no longer just about a stranger. It was about the word and the honor of one of their most respected warriors. Finally, the elder gave a slow, deliberate nod. "The debt is yours. Ayanna, see that it is paid." The tension in the air eased, but it did not vanish. Fletcher had been granted a reprieve, not a pardon. The moment of personal drama was immediately eclipsed by the larger crisis. Nayeli stepped forward, her face grim. "The marshal is not idle," she reported to the council. "My scouts have counted his men. There are 30 riders, maybe more, and they are closing the net. They have found the mine. They are sweeping the forests. They will find this valley by tomorrow, or the day after." A wave of fear and resolve passed through the camp. The council began to speak in low, urgent tones, their dialogue a rapid exchange of tactical assessments. "We cannot fight 30 rifles," one of the women said. "Not here, not with the children." "We must move the camp," another elder decided. "Tonight, we must go to the winter shelter in the deep mountains." "It will be a slow journey," Takakota argued. "The children, the elders, the marshal's men are mounted. They will run us down before we are halfway there." The reality of their situation was grim. They were trapped. They could not stay, but they could not flee without being caught in the open. A heavy silence fell once more as they confronted the brutal mathematics of their survival. It was the oldest member of the council, the man who had questioned Fletcher, who finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "We cannot outrun them," he said. "So we must mislead them. We must send them on a false chase, a long chase, one that will give us the time we need to disappear into the mountains." He paused, and his old, wise eyes swept over the grim faces before him. They settled, with an unnerving weight, on Fletcher. "We need a decoy." The elder's words hung in the cold mountain air, heavy and final. "We need a decoy." It was not a suggestion. It was a pronouncement of a necessary sacrifice. Every eye in the council circle, in the entire assembled camp, was turned inward, weighing the cost. Who among them could be spared, who could be asked to ride into the jaws of the wolf to save the flock? The silence was a living thing, filled with the unspoken names of sons, brothers, and husbands. Into that void, Fletcher's voice fell, calm and steady. "I'll do it." Every head snapped toward him. The shock was a palpable wave that rippled through the community. Takakota's face was a mask of disbelief, his jaw tight with suspicion. The elders stared, their ancient eyes trying to read the truth in this stranger, this enemy who now offered himself as their shield. Fletcher's gaze did not waver. He looked at the old man who had questioned him. "I'm the logical choice," he said, his tone flat and practical. "Stripped of any heroism. They are hunting a ghost in a copper mask. But they are also hunting me. My tracks are known to them. If they find my trail leading away from here, they will follow. They will believe their prey is running." He paused, letting the tactical sense of it sink in. "But I'll need things. A good horse, the fastest you have, a full water skin and as much dried meat as you can spare." He then turned his head and looked directly at Ayanna. His next words directed only at her. "And I need proof, something they will recognize, something they will chase without question." He didn't have to say it. Everyone knew what he meant. The copper mask, the symbol of their resistance, their ghost. Before the council could speak, before anyone could assent or protest, Ayanna moved. She grabbed his arm, her grip like steel, and pulled him away from the fire, away from the watching eyes, toward the dark edge of the pine forest. Her movements were sharp, angry. She spun him around when they were in the deep shadows of the trees, her face a storm of emotions he could not quite read. Anger was there, burning in her dark eyes, but beneath it was something else, something that looked terrifyingly like fear. "No," she said, the word a low, fierce command. "You cannot." They need time. Ayana, he said, his voice quiet, this is the only way to buy it. This is a death sentence. You don't know this land. They will run you down in a day. You are a tracker, not a spirit. You cannot outrun 30 rifles in your own territory, let alone in ours. I'm better at leaving than you think, he said, a ghost of his old, lonely self flickering in the words. This isn't leaving, she shot back, her voice cracking with a raw emotion he had never heard from her before. This is dying. For what? For us, you are not one of us. This is not your fight. You made it my fight, he said, his voice dropping, becoming more intense. When you stood before that council and staked your honor on my life, you made this my debt to pay. He took a step closer, their faces inches apart in the gloom. The anger in her eyes was warring with the fear, and he saw the tremor in her jaw. Don't tell me I can't do this. Give me another reason, a real reason. He wasn't asking for a tactical argument. He was asking for the truth that was churning behind her eyes. He was challenging the warrior and speaking to the woman he had seen on the mountain ledge. She was out of words. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. The arguments, the logic, the anger, all of it failed her. There was only the brutal, unspoken truth of the moment. She couldn't give him another reason because the real reason was too new, too fragile to be spoken aloud. She was afraid to lose him. Her hand, which had been clenched into a fist at her side, slowly uncurled. She lifted it, not to strike him, not to push him away, but with a strange, hesitant tenderness. Her fingers, rough and calloused from a life of survival, brushed against his cheek. Her touch was a brand, a silent confession that said everything her words could not. The world seemed to fall away. There was only the feel of her skin on his, the darkness of the forest, and the ragged sound of their breathing. He leaned into her touch, and in the next moment, she closed the small distance between them. The kiss was not soft or gentle. It was a collision, short and desperate and burning with a fierce, painful heat. It was the taste of wood smoke, of fear, of a promise being made and a goodbye being said all in the same instant. It was the frantic pressure of two people trying to say a lifetime of things in a single, breathless moment. When they broke apart, they were both breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other. "Come back," she whispered, the words a prayer against his lips. "I will," he breathed back, the words a vow. They walked back to the council fire, the unspoken thing that had passed between them hanging in the air like a visible shield. The decision had been made. Ayana stepped before the elders, her composure regained, her voice once again that of a leader. "I will go with him," she announced, her statement sending another ripple of shock through the crowd. Takakota opened his mouth to protest, but she cut him off. "I will guide him for the first 2 days. I know the paths that will seem like a straight run but are a fool's errand, the trails that will leave a clear track but lead to a dead end. I will lead him on a chase that will buy you not 3 days, but 5. Then I will circle back through the high passes. He will ride on alone." It was a brilliant compromise, a plan that salved her fear and served their people. She was not just protecting him. She was using her knowledge to make his sacrifice more potent. The council conferred for only a moment. The old man looked at Ayana, then at Fletcher, his eyes holding a new, deep understanding. He nodded. "It is decided." The preparations were swift and silent. A lean, wiry Mustang with fire in its eyes was brought for Fletcher. Saddlebags were filled with food and water, as a warrior handed him a rifle. Takakota approached. He held out a worn but razor-sharp knife, the same one Fletcher had lost in the canyon. "A man who rides to his death should not do so unarmed," Takakota said, his voice still gruff, but the open hostility in his eyes had been replaced by a grudging, almost imperceptible, respect. Fletcher took the knife and nodded his thanks. Then Ayana brought it. She carried the copper mask not as a weapon, but as a sacred object. It gleamed in the firelight, its smooth, featureless face seeming to hold all the secrets of their struggle. She did not hand it to him. Instead, she walked to his horse and tied the mask to the side of the saddle with a leather thong, where it would hang. Visible to anyone who followed, it was a beacon, a target, a lamp lit to draw the wolves. The entire village gathered to watch them leave. There were no cheers, no shouted farewells. There was only a heavy, profound silence. The children watched with wide, solemn eyes. Too young to understand the strategy, but old enough to sense the weight of the moment. The women watched with expressions of stoic grief, for they knew the price of survival. The old men, the council members, watched with a look that was both an honor and a burden, their gaze a silent blessing and a heavy expectation. Fletcher was no longer a stranger. He was their gamble, their hope, their sacrifice. He swung himself into the saddle. Ayanna mounted her own horse beside him. They looked at each other one last time, a silent exchange that confirmed the promise made in the dark. Then, together, they turned their horses and spurred them into a gallop. The thunder of their two horses' hooves echoed from the valley wall, a sharp, defiant sound against the morning quiet. They rode up the grassy slope and onto the ridge overlooking the valley. As they hit the ridge line, a sound answered them from far across the mountains, faint but clear, the call of a military bugle. The hunt had begun. They rode hard all day, pushing west away from the mountains where the people were fleeing, creating a clear, deliberate trail. They did not speak, saving their breath and their horses' strength. The sun beat down, and the world became a blur of motion, dust, and the rhythmic pounding of hooves. Late in the afternoon, Fletcher glanced over his shoulder. Behind them, stretching back for miles, a plume of dust rose against the brilliant blue sky. It was thick and dark, growing larger by the minute. It was not the dust of 2 riders. It was the dust of 30. It followed them like a relentless, gathering storm cloud, and it was getting closer. The chase was a brutal form of communication. Ayanna did not ride to escape. She rode to be seen. She led them along high, open ridges, a deliberate silhouette against the sky. She kept to the spine of the hills, where their pursuit would be clearly visible to her, and where their own 2 figures, with the glinting copper mask on Fletcher's saddle, would be a constant, infuriating beacon to the men who followed. It was a masterful, nerve-shredding performance. She played with distance, letting the posse gain on them in the open flats, only to pull away again in the broken country she knew so well. She was a fisherman, letting out the line, feeling the weight of her catch, then reeling them in just enough to keep them from breaking free. Fletcher had never experienced anything like it. It was a hunt in reverse, and he was the bait. He could hear them now, not just the thunder of their hooves, but the faint, wind-whipped sounds of their shouts, raw and angry. They were close, too close. The sun was dipping below the horizon, and the long shadows were merging into a single, vast pool of darkness. They couldn't keep this pace up forever. The horses were lathered in sweat, their breathing a harsh, ragged saw in the twilight. "This way!" Ayanna called out, her voice tight, and veered her horse sharply toward a dark slash in a rock wall. It was a fissure, an ancient watercourse that had carved a deep, narrow channel into the hillside. They plunged into it, the sudden darkness and silence a jarring relief from the open chase. They dismounted, their legs trembling with exhaustion, and led the heaving horses deeper into the passage. It was tight, the rock scraping their shoulders, but it opened into a small, hidden chamber, a natural corral just large enough for the 2 of them and their mounts. From the outside, the entrance was nearly invisible, a meaningless shadow among other shadows. They were hidden. For now. The sounds of the posse grew louder as they thundered past the entrance. The men's voices clear now. They were right here. They vanished into thin air. The sounds faded as the marshal led his men further down the ridge. Fletcher leaned his head against the cool, damp rock, his body screaming with fatigue. Ayanna immediately went to the horses, stroking their necks, murmuring to them in her own language, her voice a low, soothing melody. When they had calmed, she turned to him. In the deep gloom, he could just make out her face. She came closer and pointed to a dark stain on his sleeve, near his bandaged forearm. The wound she had tended had reopened during the hard ride. "Sit," she commanded softly. He slid down the rock wall to the ground. She knelt before him again, just as she had at the hidden spring. She untied the bandage, her movements economical and sure. But as her fingers brushed his skin to clean the wound with a cloth dampened from her water skin, he felt it a slight, almost imperceptible tremor in her hand. It was a tiny betrayal of the iron control she held over herself, a fleeting admission of the fear and exhaustion that she refused to show in her eyes. The professional, practiced motion of a healer was at war with the trembling hand of a woman pushed to her limit. She worked in silence, her head bent, her hair falling forward to hide her face. He watched the careful, precise way she applied a fresh poultice and rewrapped the arm. The touch was both clinical and achingly gentle. It was a language all its own, speaking of care and a fierce, protective instinct that went beyond their alliance of survival. When she finished, she did not move away. She remained kneeling before him, her hands resting on his arm. "You ride like a man with nothing to lose," she said, her voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the quiet. "Maybe I don't," he answered honestly. "Don't," she said, and her head came up, her eyes locking on his in the darkness. The fire was still there, but it was a different kind of fire now, not the blaze of a warrior, but the deep, steady glow of a banked ember. "Don't turn your courage into foolishness. This is not a game to see who is the bravest. Your life is not just your own anymore." She paused, her grip tightening slightly on his arm. Live, and then you can keep your promises." Her words were a quiet confession, an admission that the vow he had made to return was something she was holding on to, a fragile hope in the midst of a desperate fight. He understood that she was not just tending to a wound in his arm. She was trying to mend the self-destructive loneliness she saw in him. Before he could find the words to respond, the night outside their shelter exploded. A volley of rifle shots cracked through the darkness, followed by a chorus of war cries that echoed off the rocks. It was a new sound, a third voice in the violent conversation of the night. The shouts of the marshal's men turned from anger to surprise and pain. The orderly sounds of a posse became the chaotic din of a battle. Fletcher and Ayanna scrambled to the mouth of their cave. Peering out, in the sporadic flashes of gunfire, they saw a scene of utter chaos. A group of Apache warriors, maybe a dozen of them, had descended on the marshal's men like ghosts. They were on foot, moving through the rocks and shadows, firing and then melting away. Their attack a whirlwind of controlled fury. It was Takakota's patrol. They had followed, a shadow army protecting their decoy. "They're giving us a chance," Ayanna whispered, her voice tight with a mixture of pride and fear for her people. "We have to take it." The battle was their cover. They led their exhausted horses out of the cave and into the chaos. No one noticed them. Every man was locked in his own desperate fight for survival. Ayanna led him away from the firefight, not down, but up. She pointed to a steep, treacherous-looking slope, a wall of loose shale and rock that seemed to rise directly into the star-filled sky. "There," she said, "an old goat path. It is the only way." The climb was a fresh hell. The horses, already spent, scrambled for purchase on the loose rock, their iron-shod hooves slipping and sending cascades of stones clattering down into the darkness. Fletcher's Mustang lost its footing, its back legs sliding out from under it with a panicked squeal. It started to go down, threatening to pull him with it. In an instant, Ayanna was off her own horse, grabbing his reins, her feet planted, her body straining to add her own strength to the struggling animals. He scrambled to the horse's side, pushing, calming it, and together they managed to get the terrified animal back on solid ground. For a moment, they leaned against the horse, their hands touching over the saddle, their breath mingling in the cold air. a silent acknowledgement of their mutual dependence. They pushed on, pulling the horses, fighting for every foot of elevation. By the time they reached the top of the ridge, the sounds of the battle below had faded. They were alone again, under the vast, silent canopy of the stars. They had escaped. They found a small, sheltered spot behind a cluster of wind-scoured junipers and let the horses graze on the sparse grass. They knew they could not rest for long. "They will regroup by dawn," Fletcher said, looking back the way they had come. "The marshal is too stubborn to give up." "He will be angry now," Ayanna agreed, "and more determined than ever. He will think I was with the war party, that this was all a planned ambush." They sat side by side, their shoulders almost touching. The shared danger and exhaustion a bond stronger than rope. They both knew what the coming dawn meant. "Tomorrow," Fletcher said, and the word felt like a shard of glass in his throat. "You'll have to head back." "Yes," she said. "I have to be sure my people are safe. I must rejoin them." The word hung in the air between them, sharp and cold. Tomorrow. It was a deadline, a wall they were riding toward at full speed. All the unspoken things, all the fragile connections forged in fire and darkness, would be tested against that single word. He turned to her. The moon was gone, but the stars were bright enough to see the clean, strong lines of her face, the quiet resolve in her eyes. "If I live through this," he said, his voice low and raw, the words pulled from a place deeper than he knew he had, "I will find you." It was not a boast. It was a promise sworn to the night and to the woman beside him. It was the first promise he had ever made in his life that he was terrified of breaking. She did not answer immediately. She reached into a small pouch at her belt and pulled something out. She pressed it into his hand. It was a stone, small and flat and smooth, worn by water or time. It was cool against his skin. "I will be waiting," she said, her voice so soft it was almost carried away by the wind. He closed his hand around the stone, its solid reality an anchor in the uncertainty of the future. He could feel, faintly, a pattern etched into its surface. The sky to the east was beginning to soften from black to a pale, luminous blue. Dawn was coming. Ayanna stood up, a fluid, silent motion. She walked to her horse and swung herself into the saddle. She looked down at him one last time, her expression unreadable, 1,000 things passing behind her eyes. Then, without another word, she turned her horse and rode away, a lone figure melting into the gathering light, leaving him and the ghost of her promise alone on the high ridge. The world became a single, grinding note of survival. The moment Ayanna's silhouette disappeared into the dawn, Fletcher was no longer a man. He was a purpose. He was a lure. Every instinct, every skill he had honed over a lifetime of moving unseen was now inverted. He became a master of being found. He did not ride in the cover of ravines. He rode the high, open ground. He snapped a low-hanging branch, leaving a bright, fresh wound in the wood for any eye to see. He guided his Mustang through a patch of soft sand, allowing the hooves to stamp a deep, clear invitation. He was a storyteller, and the story he wrote on the land had only one word: here. For 2 days, it was a grueling rhythm: ride, rest, ride. The posse behind him was a relentless machine. Their dust cloud was his constant companion, a permanent feature on the horizon. Sometimes, when the wind was right, he could hear the faint echo of their shouts, a sound of pure frustration. The gunfire started on the second day. It was never a true battle. It was psychological. A single rifle shot would crack from a mile back, the bullet whizzing high over his head or thudding into the dirt 100 yards away. It was a message. We are here. We are not stopping. You cannot rest. His supplies dwindled with an alarming speed. The jerky was gone by the end of the second day. His water was a precious, sloshing weight that he guarded with his life. He rationed it with the discipline of a monk, allowing himself a single, small mouthful only when the sun reached specific points in the sky. He would hold the lukewarm water in his mouth, letting it soothe his cracked lips and swollen tongue before swallowing. The sun was his clock and his tormentor, a merciless eye in a bleached white sky. The land itself was an enemy, offering no shade, no water, no relief. There was only rock, sand, and the endless, shimmering heat. On the third day, the Mustang began to fail. The fire that had been in its eyes was now a dull ember. Its gait became a stumble, its head hanging low. Fletcher could feel the life draining out of the animal with every step, the powerful muscles trembling with exhaustion. He felt a pang of guilt, of sorrow for the noble beast he was riding into the ground. But there was no choice. He pushed it on, his own exhaustion a dull ache that had settled deep in his bones. He saw the terrain he needed ahead, a vast, treacherous slope of loose shale and broken rock, a place a cautious man would ride miles to avoid. For Fletcher, it was a tool. He spurred the flagging horse into the rock field. The noise was deafening. A constant clatter and slide of stone. The horse struggled, its iron shoes finding no purchase. It was a slow, agonizing process. But Fletcher knew the posse behind them, with their heavier horses and their rage for speed, would be slowed even more. He looked back from the top of the slope and saw them, a line of frustrated figures at the bottom, their progress reduced to a crawl. He had bought himself another few hours, but the cost was high. The Mustang was barely standing, its legs quivering, its breath coming and shuddering, painful gasps. The fourth day was a blur of sun and thirst. The posse had made up the time. They were closer now, close enough that he could occasionally see the glint of sun on a rifle barrel. They were pushing him, corralling him toward a series of box canyons where he could be easily trapped. His mind, clouded by dehydration and fatigue, raced to find another trick, another way to buy time. He found it in a narrow pass. A large, flat-faced boulder stood like a sentinel on one side of the trail. Fletcher dismounted, his legs shaky beneath him. He hid himself and the horse behind a smaller outcrop and waited. He was a hunter again. For one brief moment, he watched as the posse rode into the pass, their figures framed against the rock. He did not aim for a man. He raised his rifle, took a steadying breath, and aimed for the rock face, about 10 feet above their heads. He fired a single shot. The report was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet struck the boulder with a loud crack, shattering the surface. A spray of sharp rock fragments, a man-made shrapnel, rained down on the trail. He heard cries of pain and surprise. The lead riders reined in their horses, which were rearing in panic. He saw one man fall from his saddle, clutching his face. It was chaos. It was confusion. It was exactly what he needed. Before they could regroup, he was back on his horse, riding hard, the sound of their curses fading behind him. The fifth day began with a prayer for an end. He was a shell, a husk of a man being driven by a single, burning thought. Ayanna, her face, her whispered promise, the feel of the smooth stone in his pocket. It was the only fuel he had left. The Mustang was walking now, a dead-limbed shuffle, each step an agony. He knew it did not have another mile in it. He was guiding it through a patch of dry, cracked earth when the ground simply vanished. One moment, the horse was beneath him. The next, it was gone. Its foreleg had plunged into a deep, covered animal burrow. There was a sickening crack of bone and a high, terrified scream from the animal. Fletcher was thrown forward, a violent catapulting motion. He flew over the horse's head and landed hard, his left shoulder taking the full force of the impact against the unyielding ground. A bolt of pure, white-hot agony shot through him. He felt a sickening pop as his shoulder was wrenched from its socket. For a moment, he lay there, blind and breathless with pain. The world was a spinning vortex of nausea and fire. He pushed himself up, his right arm trembling. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, a dead weight of excruciating pain. The Mustang lay on the ground, its leg bent at an impossible angle, its eyes wide with terror and pain. Behind him, he heard a triumphant shout. "He's down, we've got him." There was no time for sorrow, no time for pain. He scrambled to his feet, his vision tunneling, and ran. He was on foot, injured, in the middle of an open plain. It was over. He ran for the only cover he could see, a low, rocky ridge a few hundred yards away. His lungs burned. Every jarring step sent a fresh wave of agony through his shoulder. He could hear the bullets now, not as distant cracks, but as intimate, terrifying whispers. He heard the zip as they cut the air past his ear, the sharp thwack as they hit the dirt at his feet. His sweat was so thick and salty in his mouth it tasted like blood. He reached the base of the ridge and began to climb, using his one good arm to pull himself up the rock face, his boots scrabbling for purchase. He was an animal, driven by a primal need to survive. He reached the top of the ridge and collapsed, his body finally refusing to obey. He rolled onto his back, gasping for air, the pain in his shoulder a roaring inferno. He was done. He lay there, waiting for the final shot. His gaze, dim and unfocused, drifted toward the distant northern mountains. And then he saw it. It was almost nothing, a thin, impossibly faint wisp of smoke rising into the clear blue sky. It was miles away, a tiny gray thread against the vastness of the landscape. But he knew what it was. It was a campfire. It was a sign of life. It was Ayanna. They had made it. They were safe. A ragged, painful laugh escaped his lips. It had worked. All of it. The pain, the thirst, the sacrifice of his horse. It had all been worth it. Miles behind him, Marshal Thompson reined in his horse at the base of the same ridge. He watched Fletcher's clumsy, desperate scramble to the top. He raised his rifle, the sight settling on the exhausted figure. But just as his finger tightened on the trigger, his eyes caught the same thing Fletcher had seen, the distant wisp of smoke to the north. The marshal's eyes, narrowed against the sun, went from the smoke to Fletcher's position, then back to the smoke. He was a tracker, a reader of signs, and in that instant, he read the entire story. The 5-day chase, the deliberate, obvious trail, the lone rider. He had not been hunting his prey. He had been led on a leash. The realization washed over him, not with satisfaction, but with a cold, clear fury. He had been played. He looked at Fletcher, collapsed on the ridgeline, a broken, useless decoy. The marshal slowly lowered his rifle. Then he raised it again, his movements calm and deliberate, his aim steady. He could see Fletcher's head turn toward him, a final, defiant look from the man who had outsmarted him. "Well, son," Marshal Thompson said to himself, his voice a low, gravelly rasp carried away by the wind. Any last words, the marshal's finger tightened on the trigger. The world had shrunk to the space between the hammer and the pin, a breath-long moment of finality. Fletcher lay on the ridge, the fire in his shoulder, a roaring sun, and watched his death approach from 100 yards away. He had done what he had come to do. He had bought them time. He closed his eyes. But the sound that came was not the crack of a rifle. It was a low, deep rumble, a vibration that seemed to rise from the bones of the earth itself. It was the sound of a distant storm, of thunder rolling across the plains. Fletcher's eyes snapped open. The marshal had heard it too, his head turning, his aim faltering. The sound was coming from the north, from the direction of the smoke. It grew with terrifying speed, from a rumble to a roar, the unmistakable sound of 100 hooves striking the earth in unison. And then they appeared. They crested the northern ridge not as a line of men, but as a force of nature, a human waterfall, pouring down the mountainside in a torrent of furious motion. They were the warriors of Ayanna's people, and they rode with a single, unified purpose. At their head, on a lean black pony that seemed to fly over the rock, was Ayanna. She was not the masked raider now, nor the gentle healer. She was a war chief, her face set like stone, her eyes blazing with a righteous fire that could turn armies to ash. The marshal's posse, caught between Fletcher on the ridge and the impossible charge descending upon them, was thrown into utter chaos. Men shouted, horses reared, and their disciplined line dissolved into a panicked mob. They were hunters who had suddenly, terrifyingly, become the prey. Fletcher knew this was his only chance. The marshal, his attention ripped away, was shouting orders that were lost in the growing din. Using his one good arm, Fletcher pushed himself toward the edge of the ridge, away from the posse. He rolled, and the world became a dizzying, painful tumble of rock, sky, and searing agony from his shoulder. He slid and scraped down the steep slope, stones and gravel tearing at him, until he landed in a heap at the bottom, breathless and blind with pain. He lay there, helpless, as the battle raged above him. He heard the crack of rifles, the sharp, piercing cries of Apache warriors, the panicked shouts of the marshal's men. He tried to push himself up, but his body refused to obey. The world began to gray at the edges. Then, a hand seized his good arm. It was strong and sure, and it pulled him from the ground as if he weighed nothing. He stumbled, his vision clearing, and looked into the face of Ayanna. She was there, beside him, in the heart of the chaos. Her face was smudged with dust, her eyes wild with the fury of battle. But when they met his, they were filled with a fierce, protective light that was for him alone. She said nothing. She didn't have to. She pulled him toward a horse that one of her warriors had brought, and with a strength that seemed impossible, helped him into the saddle. The battle was not a rout. It was a tactical masterpiece. The warriors were not trying to annihilate the posse. They were breaking it, scattering it, buying the precious seconds needed for their retreat. They moved like a pack of wolves, striking and then vanishing, their disciplined chaos a stark contrast to the posse's disorganized panic. They were a whirlwind, and at its calm center were Fletcher and Ayanna. The warriors formed a moving screen around them as they galloped away, not west, but deep into the northern mountains, swallowing them into the land that was their greatest ally. That night, they made a temporary camp in a deep, hidden canyon, where a waterfall tumbled into a clear pool. The mood was not triumphant. It was grim, somber, but resolute. They had won a battle, not the war. Fletcher sat by a small, smokeless fire, his shoulder now properly set and bound, the pain reduced to a deep, throbbing ache. He watched as the warriors tended to their wounds and their weapons, their movements economical and quiet. The council sat across the fire from him. Takakota was there, his face grim, but the open hostility was gone, replaced by a hard-earned respect. Nayeli was there, her wrinkled face calm and knowing. And the old man, the elder who had questioned him, sat watching him, his eyes deep and thoughtful in the flickering firelight. Finally, the elder spoke, his voice carrying across the crackle of the flames. "You have kept your word," he said, his English slow and deliberate. "You bled for us. You bought us the time we needed. Our people are safe in the Winterlands. For this, we are in your debt." It was not a pardon. It was a recognition. It was an acceptance. The suspicion that had clung to him like a shroud had been burned away in the crucible of the 5-day chase. The elder leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "The debt is ours to repay, but the path ahead is long. The marshal will return. He is a man of pride, and we have wounded it. He will bring soldiers. He will bring cannons. The war is not over. It has just begun." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "You are a free man. You can take a horse and ride away. No one will stop you. Or," he looked at the faces of his people, then back at Fletcher, "if you choose, you can stay. Stay as one of us, learn our ways, share our food, fight our fight." The offer was more than a simple invitation. It was a crossroads. Behind him lay the lonely, empty world he had always known, the world of running. Ahead of him was a life of purpose, of belonging, but also of constant struggle and danger. He looked at the faces around the fire, Faces that had once looked at him with hatred and now looked at him with a weary respect. He looked at Takakota, who gave him a single, sharp nod. And then he looked at Ayana. She was watching him, her heart in her eyes, but her face was carefully neutral. The choice had to be his. He had spent his whole life running from commitment, from connection, from anything that might hold him down. He had made a fortress of his loneliness. But the walls had been breached. He felt the smooth, carved stone in his pocket. He remembered her touch on the mountain, her kiss in the darkness. He knew, with a certainty that settled in his very soul, that if he rode away now, he would be running for the rest of his life. Slowly, he reached out his good hand. Ayana watched it, then lifted her own, placing it in his. Their fingers intertwined. He looked at the elder, his voice clear and strong in the quiet canyon. "All my life I've been running," he said. "Now I choose to stay." The days that followed bled into weeks, and the weeks into months. He became a student of a world he had only ever seen from the outside. The Apache words were a clumsy music on his tongue at first, but Ayana was a patient teacher, her soft laughter at his mistakes a gentle encouragement. Takakota, his former adversary, became his gruff instructor in the art of the silent trail, teaching him to read a story in a single bent blade of grass, to tell the age of a track by the crumbling of its edges. Fletcher shared his meager rations, and in return, he was given a share of the hunt. He learned the rhythms of the seasons, the names of the secret springs, the prayers offered to the rising sun. He stood guard on the high ridges at night, looking out over the land not as a trespasser, but as a guardian. He was no longer a ghost moving through the world. He was a part of it. 6 months after he had made his choice, he stood with Ayana on the very same ridge where she had left him. The landscape was the same vast, unforgiving expanse of rock and sky. But they were different. He was different. The haunted, lonely look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet strength, a sense of peace he had never known. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the sunset, painting the clouds in hues of orange and purple. The beauty of it was sharp and clean, a world away from the dusty, violent land he had once ridden through. "I used to think this land was just dirt and rock," he said quietly, not looking at her. "Something to be crossed, something to be survived." He turned to her then, his eyes holding hers. "You taught me it was a home." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. "It was always your home," she said softly. "You just had to stop running long enough to see it." The love between them was like the mountains themselves, not declared in loud, passionate bursts, but a deep, quiet, and unshakable presence. It was in the way she would bring him a hot cup of tea on a cold night's watch, in the way he would instinctively move to stand between her and any perceived threat. It was a promise to protect, a vow as solid and enduring as the stone beneath their feet. As the last sliver of sun vanished, they saw a rider approaching from the south, moving fast. It was a scout, and his face was grim. He reined in his horse before them, his words coming in urgent, breathless bursts of Apache. Fletcher didn't need a translation. He could see the message in the man's eyes. Ayana turned to him, her face calm, but her hand tightened its grip on his. "The marshal," she said, her voice steady. "He has returned, with soldiers from the fort, many more than before." The news was a cold wind, a harbinger of the storm to come. The war had returned to their doorstep. Fletcher looked at the grim news, then at the woman beside him. He felt no fear. He felt no desire to run. He felt only a deep, unwavering resolve. He looked out at the darkening land they had sworn to protect, then back at her, their hands clasped together, a silent, unbreakable bond. "Whatever comes," he said, his voice as solid as the mountain, "we face it together." Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to my channel Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.